Thank you everyone for attending this presentation. My name is Mehul Trivedi and I'm a clinical neuropsychologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the SIU School of Medicine in Springfield. This presentation is focused on the SIU Longitudinal Cognitive Aging Study, the past, the present, and the future. Just to provide a little bit of context, this project and this research that I'm presenting has come about based on some conversations that I've had with Dr. Raj Shah at Rush, who through the Alzheimer's Disease Advisory Committee for Illinois. And so I'm just going to get started. I don't have any financial disclosures. I want to start with acknowledgement. So this study's been going on since 1984, so there's been many people who have been involved in this study, and I just like to recognize all their efforts. And then obviously the study participants. So the objectives are to describe the demographic characteristics of the SIU Longitudinal Cognitive Aging Study and present some research findings, then provide an overview of our current methods and what we're doing currently, and then describe this collaboration project between SIU School of Medicine campuses in Springfield and Carbondale and the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center that harmonizes methods to examine rural health disparities in cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease. So the LCAS is a community-based longitudinal cohort study of the incidence of neurocognitive disorders such as AD in predominantly older adults who reside in Springfield and the surrounding rural areas around central Illinois. The study was started by Dr. Ronald Zeck in 1984, and his initial focus was on improving the sensitivity of neuropsychological testing to pre-dementia syndromes such as mild cognitive impairment. The study was closed in 2016 when Dr. Zeck retired. I came to SIU in 2017, and I reopened the LCAS study in 2018 with the first participant being seen in June of 2019. Over the course of these many decades or these years, we've recruited over 1,600 older adults, primarily older adults. There are some younger adults who were included to create neuropsychological normative data. And then of the 1,600, over 100 of the participants are sisters at convents that are or were in the past located in the Springfield area. And most of these sisters are deceased, but we're currently still following 5 sisters. So to give you an overview of the inclusion-exclusion criteria, participants are recruited from the community via newspaper, advertisement, word-of-mouth, community presentations, and then also the relatives, so spouses, siblings, and children of individuals who are diagnosed with MCI or Alzheimer's disease in the Memory and Aging Clinic here at SIU. So because of that fact, the sample is enriched for persons with a family history of Alzheimer's disease. Individuals must be free of neurological, uncontrolled medical, or psychiatric illness at their first visit, and we preferably are recruiting 60 individuals age 65 plus, though as I mentioned, younger individuals were recruited for the purposes of generating age normative stratified neuropsychological data. So participants complete serial cognitive testing, 2 to 3 hours. Every effort is made to see the participants on a yearly basis. However, this is not always possible due to attrition, a variety of different factors, moving out of the area, staffing issues, participants are no longer interested, and then also the participants' belief that they are declining on testing, even in some cases when they might not actually be declining. And then they also complete a medical and psychosocial history questionnaire. There's an optional brain donation program. And then we diagnosed MCI using pretty stringent criteria for what we call late MCI, where they have to have 2 memory measures that are at least 1.5 standard deviations below their age-referenced normative group, and then a possible probable Alzheimer's dementia is diagnosed using established NINDS-ADRA criteria. So the past, just talk about the past. So before I took over the study, there was not much generated in terms of the number of publications from the data that was collected between 1984 and 2016. I'm not sure why that was the case, but it is what it is. So this is just I took this from PubMed, and you can see there are 7 publications. 3 of them were on the Boston Naming Test, creating normative data, and then 1 was on verbal fluency in Parkinson's disease versus controls, and then there was another one looking at episodic memory and closed head injury versus controls, and then 2 papers looking at the Alzheimer's disease assessment scale. And then there were several abstracts that were presented at professional conferences, but this didn't always translate into publications or external support for the study. So most of this study has been done without any external support. There is some support through there has been some support in the past from the SIU Alzheimer's Center. So the present, what have we done since I reopened the study? So this gives you a the demographic characteristics of the entire sample since 1984. So what you're seeing over here is the age breakdown for participants. You can see that it's skewed towards older adults. The mean age at baseline is about 69 years, but you can see that there are a smaller number of people who are younger. And then the mean educational attainment's about 14 years, but you can see that there's a nice range of people who have below 8 years of education to greater than 20. As with many studies in aging and dementia, the gender distribution, it's weighted towards females. So it's about 70% female, 30% male. And then it's not a very diverse cohort in terms of race, ethnicity. It's primarily 98%, in fact, white and not of Hispanic origin. And it doesn't necessarily reflect the demographics distribution of individuals from Sangamon County, which is where the most of the participants are from. And so this is the number of visits. So you can see that 1,600 people had at least one visit, and then about half had 2 visits, and then subsequently you can see the drop-off. I believe we have one participant who's had 21 visits, and I believe she's about 97 years old. She's our oldest participant. And then prior to the study closure in 2016, the average follow-up was about 622 days between visits, and then but with a very large standard deviation. So there were some instances where people weren't seen for years and then came back in for a study visit. And then since I've reopened the study, we've tried to make every effort to see people on a yearly basis. That was affected negatively by COVID, the COVID pandemic when we were shut down for a while. But it's been about 402 days. So, as I mentioned, we have 1,600 participants with at least one visit, and of those, 103 participants met the criteria for MCI or possible Alzheimer's disease at first visit, which isn't unheard of in community-based research. You're going to find people that meet the criteria for one of your exclusion criteria. And then 87 additional participants declined to meet the diagnostic criteria for MCI or Alzheimer's dementia. And then an additional 15 participants developed some other neurological condition like Parkinson's disease, stroke, Lewy body dementia, etc. And then we've also been able to keep track of participants via their electronic medical records, and an additional 87 participants were diagnosed with some kind of neurocognitive disorder based on their electronic health care records at some point after their last study visit. So this is what, in terms of how many people are living versus deceased, the vast majority of the participants are deceased, which is not unexpected given when the study started. But a not insignificant percentage are still alive. We've tried to make every effort to contact as many of the people who were alive as possible. And then unknown, these are people with common names who we don't have any other identifying information like social security number to verify whether they're alive or deceased. But given their birth dates, the likelihood is that the vast majority of these 49 are deceased. So just to kind of give you a timeline of how things have evolved since I reopened the study, in 2018, we contacted former participants who were alive, available, and capable after determining which participants had deceased within the interim in the 2 years between study closure and reopening to determine their interest. And then we did this via letter, and then the people would call or respond in some way, and they would come in for a study visit. And the first participant was seen in July of 2019, and since then we've seen we have 180 total participants that have had at least one visit. Of those, we're focused more on the people that have been in the study prior to its closure rather than recruiting new participants, and that's mostly just due to staffing issues. And this study is currently unfunded, so makes it a little bit more challenging. But the 30 new participants that we've recruited have predominantly been individuals who had some either friends, family, or spouses of individuals that were already enrolled in the study. And then as you can see here, 150 former participants have had one visit, and then we're currently seeing people in waves for their second visit and third visit. So about half have been seen for a second visit, and about a third have been seen for a third visit. This doesn't necessarily mean that these are their first, second, and third visits, because they may have had study visits prior to the study closure. So where are LCAS participants from? Where do they reside? So this is but one definition or way of defining rural versus suburban versus urban using the National Center for Educational Statistics breakdown. And so what you can see here is that the vast majority of people are from Springfield, so a mid-sized city in central Illinois. But not an insignificant number, about 300 or so, are from areas that would be considered rural or by most definitions of rural. And so that usually falls into rural and town here. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to define rural later in the presentation. So we also wanted to look at other ways to look at how what types of participants we're enrolling. So we use this area deprivation index, which was developed by Amy Kind and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin. It essentially ranks neighborhoods by socioeconomic disadvantage at the state and national level. It includes 4 theoretical domains: income, education, employment, and housing quality, and a higher score, so hot colors, reflect more disadvantaged neighborhoods. So this is what Illinois looks like in terms of area deprivation index. And so most of our participants are coming from around here. So there's a nice mix of less disadvantaged and more disadvantaged areas. As you can see actually right along the I-55 corridor, you can see those are relatively less disadvantaged areas compared to places that are further off the I-55 corridor. So the current state is, as I mentioned, 150 previously enrolled participants, 30 new participants. 3 participants have passed away since the study reopened, and 14 current participants meet the criteria for late MCI, and 3 have been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. So this is the neuropsychological test battery. It's comprehensive. It's long. It's 2.5 to 3 hours. But it captures all the major cognitive domains. So orientation and mental status. We also administer the cognitive subscale of the Alzheimer's disease assessment scale. There's 3 measures of learning and memory. There's measures of language, visuospatial skills, processing speed and mental flexibility, and then problem solving and reasoning skills. We also give questionnaires. I've revamped this and added some questionnaires based on the current state of the literature. The 2 bold-faced ones are ones that were inherited, so they were administered prior to study closure, so the executive function questionnaire and then the Beck Depression Inventory. I added other measures, so geriatric anxiety, geriatric depression, a self-reported memory functioning questionnaire, a self-reported cognitive activity scale, a functional activity measure, a social network scale, a diet questionnaire, and then a physical activity questionnaire, the CHAMPS. And then all participants are also completing a detailed medical history inventory that includes information about family, medical, and psychosocial histories. And then additional information that we're collecting, as I mentioned, occupational complexity scores, and then the ADI measures, as I mentioned. So there's also, as I mentioned, there's an optional brain donation program. So far, since its inception, there's 26 participants have donated their brains and had an autopsy performed. 17 were diagnosed with AD. Prior to the study closure, there were an additional 38 controls who had signed the intent to donate form, but passed away without their brains being collected. And I don't necessarily know the reason for that. And then I've tried to make this an emphasis, is that for the brain donation, so we've had 46 participants who've completed the intent to donate brain form since the study reopened, and so that's about a third of the 150 new people, 150 participants that we've seen. And one participant who completed the intent to donate form passed away without brain collection or autopsy. We were never notified that this participant had passed away. I found out by looking in the obituaries. So current findings, these are just a couple of, since there was such a paucity of research data that was published with, or research that was published with data, I thought it was important to kind of show productivity. So we've tried to emphasize looking at this data and analyzing it to see what's there. And so the first step that we did is we wanted to do a data reduction. So we took all of the neuropsychological test measures and we used principal component analysis to reduce the 23 measures down to a more manageable number, to reduce the issues with multiple comparisons when we're doing other more advanced statistics. So in this paper that we've submitted recently and is under review, we excluded individuals who met the criteria for MCI or Alzheimer's at baseline or declined to meet these conditions within 3 consecutive visits, but when the information was available. So as there were people obviously that we didn't follow long enough, and it's possible that people developed that we included developed Alzheimer's disease, but after 4 consecutive visits. And so this PCA, we identified a 4-component model that explains 64% of variance in the data set. So a speed cognitive flexibility component, a visuospatial skills component, a wordless learning and memory component, and a story memory component. We also found a 3-component model explaining less variance, 58%, where the 2 memory components grouped onto 1 component. But again, we went with the 4-factor or the 4-component model because it did explain the most variance in the data set. Our second step was to kind of confirm, so this shows the loading that you can see. So here is our speed-based measures, and these are all common timed measures. Then you can see our visuospatial measures, which are very common visuospatial measures. And then you can see the word list, learning and memory, and then the story memory factor or component. And then so, we wanted to confirm previous research that increasing age was going to be associated with reduced cognitive functioning, and we do confirm that. And we did this after adjusting for gender and education. And this figure shows that figures A and B are for speed, cognitive flexibility, and visuospatial skills respectively, and that's where we showed the strongest relationship between age and the component scores, less so for the 2 memory measures. And so we're hoping to use these components to examine relationships between other various data that we're collecting, like the area deprivation index, occupational complexity, family history, differences, etc., and then cognitive decline in the LCAS study. So there's also been some medical students have been using this data for their research projects, and these are just 2. I'm not going to talk about these too much. One student used the clock drawing test to look at executive functioning and dementia and controls, and then another student compared baseline mini mental status exam scores in people who converted to who declined to develop Alzheimer's disease versus those that did not, and he shows that there's about a 0.5 to 1 point difference. So the people who the decliners showed a 0.5 to 1 point difference, lower scores on the mini mental total score than the people who did not decline. And so the second study that I wanted to talk about is we used the Alzheimer's disease assessment scale, and we wanted to see if, we wanted to kind of confirm findings again. So is there a relationship between increasing age and the total error scores for the original and extended cognitive subscale of the ADAS after controlling for demographic variables? And then are the original and extended versions of the ADAS sensitive to staging of normal controls, late MCI, and AD? And I should mention that this extended version is an experimental version that has added certain tests to the original ADAS. It hasn't changed the ADAS, the original, so the original remains uncontaminated. These are just extended versions which were incorporated to improve the sensitivity of the original ADAS to pre-dementia syndromes. And so just to provide context for the figures I'm going to show next is the original ADAS has a score range of 0 to 70, and the extended ADAS has an error score range of 0 to 170. And so here you can see that increasing age was, as we expected, was associated with higher error scores. So worse performance reflects higher error scores on the ADAS. And so this was after controlling for age or gender and education. So you can see on the left, you see the original ADAS, and on the right, you see the total extended ADAS. And we're currently determining which ADAS subtests are driving the age effects. And then in the second part of the study, we found that, yeah, there was a significant difference, that the ADAS was pretty good at discriminating between control, MCI, and Alzheimer's dementia groups. And so you can see here the purple is the original ADAS, and the gray is the extended ADAS scores. And you can see that both the original and the extended ADAS were able to discriminate between controls, MCI, and Alzheimer's, and then also between MCI and Alzheimer's groups. And so we're trying to determine which subtests within the ADAS are responsible for these findings. We have some hypotheses based on existing literature, but we're currently conducting those analyses. And so the future. So this, I kind of just to set the stage for this. So Dr. Shah and I used to work when I was at Rush. Prior to 2013, before I left, Dr. Shah had been assisted with participant recruitment for an Alzheimer's Association new investigator research grant that I was awarded while I was still at Rush. And so we've worked together extensively since I was a fellow at Rush, and since I was transitioned to assistant professor at Rush before I moved on to SIU. And so I just want to I'm going to talk about a project that we've discussed several over the past couple of years and in person at the Alzheimer's Disease Advisory Committee meetings. And so just kind of to provide a little bit of context, so I want to focus on I want to discuss for a bit social determinants of health, health equity, and health disparities. So there are ethnic and racial and geographic health disparities. So what the research is showing is that individuals living in rural areas and some ethnic racial minorities living in more metropolitan areas in the United States experience similar health disparities. There are differences, but there are also there's some overlap. And but what the research has also shown is that ethnic racial minorities residing in rural areas of the United States, well, they really experience the most significant health disparities. And so what are some social determinants of health? Well, we have, it involves a lot of different areas: economic stability, neighborhood and physical environment, education, food, community and social contexts, and healthcare system. So kind of like where we live, work, and play, can have a significant impact on our health and wellness. And these social determinants of health relate to health outcomes like mortality, morbidity, life expectancy, etc. And then there are some barriers to use of health services for some minority communities is, obviously less access to healthcare and health insurance, less likely to seek out treatment, poor quality care, higher levels of stigma, culturally homogeneous healthcare system, racism, bias, or discrimination in healthcare settings, and then language barriers for certain populations as well. And then there are a number of, as I mentioned, there are a number of common health disparities for some minority and rural communities. So one, compared to rural and urban and suburban residents, rural residents, one, they're more likely to be white and married and less likely to have graduated from high school. They tend to be older and sicker relative to their urban and suburban counterparts. And then common health disparities between these communities are they're more likely to experience poverty, be uninsured for longer periods of time, more likely to have less access to healthcare and specialists, more likely to experience higher rates of physical, cognitive, and social limitations, engage in risky health behaviors, smoking, heavy alcohol consumption. They experience higher rates of chronic vascular conditions like diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, obesity, things like that, and activity limitations because of those. And then also there's an increased risk of cognitive decline and dementia, which is underdiagnosed due to all of these factors that I've just discussed on these last two slides. So this slide was taken from the Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures. They publish this every year and update the information, but this just shows that there's a 1.5 to 2 time greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease in older Black and Hispanic Americans compared to older white Americans. And then most of the differences are due to some of these health disparities that we've discussed. So variations in health, chronic comorbid medical conditions, lifestyle, and socioeconomic factors account for most of these differences. So now I'm kind of want to talk a little bit about these geographic health disparities. So it's really challenging to do look at rural versus urban disparities because, and that's why there's not been a lot of research done, is because it's just very challenging because rural areas are spread apart. They're usually not located near major metropolitan centers where these large cohort studies are typically conducted, and they're also far apart from each other. So rural areas are far apart from each other. They're far apart from major metropolitan areas, so they're very secluded. But research has shown that dementia and cognitive impairment is underdiagnosed in rural areas. So and one of the reasons is because there's so many different ways to define regions in the United States: metropolitan areas, Office of Management and Budget, the NCES framework, U.S. Census, population density, UIC and RUCC codes as well. Population thresholds used to differentiate rural and urban vary from 2,500 up to 50,000 depending on the definition. And then many people live in areas that are not clearly rural or not clearly urban. So just small changes in the way you have these definitions can have a major impact on what's considered rural. And so this impacts federal and state programs, eligibility for federal and state programs. So this is just one example of the differences. So this is the OMB classification system: metro, non-metro, micropolitan, and non-metro, non-core. And then this is the U.S. Census classification: urbanized, urban clusters, and rural. As you can see, what's considered rural in the U.S. Census is much different than what's considered to be rural in the OMB classification system. So because of this, there hasn't been a lot of studies looking at cognitive impairment in rural and urban, or comparing cognitive impairment in rural and urban areas. So this is a study that was published by Whedon et al. And they use the health and retirement study, which participants are administered the TICS, the telephone interview of cognitive status. Dementia and cognitive impairment, no dementia, were based on Adams criteria using the TIC scores. They used the U.S. Census definition for rural and urban. Prevalence rates declined from 2000 to 2010 in both rural and urban areas. Dementia rates were significantly higher in rural versus urban areas in 2000. They remained higher in rural versus urban areas in 2010, but they were no longer significantly greater. And almost all of the decline was related to the increased level of educational attainment in rural areas. But the authors still mentioned that it may be underdiagnosed due to the lack of access to specialists trained in diagnosing these conditions. So this is just what they've shown. So you can see here's rural dementia rates in purple or in 2000, in gray or in 2010 in the rural, and then you can see in urban, and then you can see cognitive impairment, no dementia in 2010 in rural areas here. And so you can see there is a higher level. It's not great. It's not that much higher, but it has gotten smaller. But again, the conditions may be underdiagnosed in these populations, or at least in some of these populations. So now I want to transition and talk more about the research proposal that that Dr. Shah and I have been discussing. And so I'm going to describe the characteristics very briefly describe the methods for 5 large cohort studies that are being conducted at Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And a lot of this information was taken from a paper that was published recently by David Marquez, who is one of the leaders of one of the cohorts, or is a leader of one of the cohorts. And so there's 5, as I mentioned, 5. There's the Memory and Aging Project, which is focused on mostly white, not Hispanic adults living in the Chicago area. There's the Religious Orders Study, which is focused on Roman Catholic clergy members with several sites across the country. Then there's the MARS Project, which is focused primarily on older Black individuals, again, who reside in primarily in the Chicago area. And then there's also the RADC African American Core, which also follows older Black adults that live in and around the Chicagoland area. And then the Latino Core focuses on older Latino Hispanic individuals who reside, again, in the Chicago metropolitan area for the most part. So just to kind of briefly describe the methods, Ross and MAP participants agree to annual clinical evaluations and organ donation after death. In Mars and the other two AA Core and Latino Core participants agree to annual clinical evaluations, but brain donation is optional. To date, there's been over 5,000 participants have been recruited. All 5 studies use harmonized data collection procedures, and the entire evaluation takes about 4 hours, with follow-ups being shorter. All visits are conducted in the patient's home, and there's a multidisciplinary team that are involved in each study visit. And so again, this is what each evaluation entails. So assessment of psychological, experiential, medical risk factors, self-rating of disability status, neurological exam, neuropsychological testing, motor, gait, and physical function exam, laboratory testing, and then finally diagnostic classification using established methods for a variety of different Alzheimer's, dementia, MCI, stroke, Parkinson's, Lewy body, etc. So now I want to talk about the project that Dr. Shah and I have been discussing. So I hope to submit this soon as an R01 research project. I'm looking at May or the June, October submission windows for the NIH, but this proposal is to develop a SIU rural cohort of older adults residing in rural communities in southern Illinois, and we will use harmonized data collection procedures that are being used in the 5 rush cohorts. And the goal is to recruit 300 people, 350 above the age of 75, who are free of cognitive impairment at baseline, and then 350 to account for possible attrition. So 70 new participants a year over the course of the 5-year funding period. And the broad main hypothesis is that older adults residing in rural Illinois will demonstrate increased incidence of cognitive decline to MCI and dementia over the 5-year follow-up period compared to their suburban counterparts who are participating in the MAP study. And then this effect will be sort of mediated, for lack of a better word, or associated with higher prevalence of comorbid vascular conditions and differences in lifestyle behavior, which are also risk factors for cognitive decline and dementia. And then in terms of brain autopsy, which we hope to continue in this, is that you would expect that there might be more mixed pathology, so mixed Alzheimer's and cerebrovascular disease pathology. And then an ancillary hypothesis, which I'm still trying to work out, it's an unknown question as to how you would form this hypothesis, is how will the rural cohort compare to the Mars, AA Core, and Latino cohorts? I think that's up for debate. Maybe they're intermediate. Are they similar? I think that's one interesting aspect of this study. So to kind of tell you, what's about the feasibility. So participants currently enrolled in LCAS will be asked if they would like to continue using predominantly the RUSH protocol. And then new participants, the plan is to recruit them, at least partially, leveraging the infrastructure of the SIU Center for Family and Community Medicine clinics, which have FQHCs in Carbondale, and there's also additional CFCM sites in Decatur, Quincy, Springfield, Lincoln, Jacksonville, and Taylorville. So one of the collaborators, Dr. Hoffman, on the project, I asked her to provide me with the number of people over the age of 75 who were seen in these clinics, and you can see these here in Carbondale. It was 418, Decatur 329, Quincy 401, and then Lincoln, Jacksonville, and Taylorville 88, and then in Springfield you see the most. And then I want to acknowledge that this is different than what the RUSH cohorts are doing, but I think it's necessary because it's much harder to get in contact with older adults who live in rural areas. So our participants that we recruit from this are likely to be healthier. So we'll also use similar recruitment strategies. We'll mirror the RADC, so community outreach, local newspapers, partnerships with retirement communities, etc. So yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say there. Okay. So what kind of communities do LCAS and RADC cohort participants live in? So I'm going to go back to the ADI slide I showed before. So, this is generalizing. I don't know where all the RADC participants come from. Maybe they come from all over the country. I'm sure people have moved out of the area and may come back. I know that people have done that for the LCAS study. So, but broadly speaking, they're from the Chicago metropolitan area. So I know this isn't probably reflective exactly, but generally speaking. And then the SIU LCAS, again, same caveats as to the RADC cohort, but these people are generally coming from central Illinois. in surrounding areas. And then the SIU rural cohort, we would like them to come from Southern Illinois, from some of these. So you can see that hopefully we're capturing places, the hot colors are more disadvantaged. Hopefully we're capturing a group of people who are going to have higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease and recruit them into the rural cohort using the Rush protocol. So I've worked with some of my colleagues and collaborators to develop research teams. And so we have a Springfield site that currently is running the LCAS study, and it's led by myself, and there's some assistance from the Center for Clinical Research and then also the SIU Alzheimer's Center as well. And then the brain collections are being performed by the Sangamon County coroner, and this is through already established relationships between the Alzheimer's Center and the coroner for individuals that participate in research studies at the center. And then so the Carbondale site, Dr. Kathleen Schmidt, who is a psychologist in the Department of Psychology at SIU Carbondale, and then there will be assistance from the SIU CFCM research team, which is led by Dr. Rebecca Hoffman. And then brain collections will be performed by Dr. Diana Sarko, who is faculty at the SIU School of Medicine campus in Carbondale. And then, as I've mentioned, Dr. Shaw and I have been, the project would would harmonize data collection procedures. So then, developing some type of data sharing and training arrangement through Dr. Shaw and then potentially other RADC staff and faculty who are interested in, kind of being involved in this. And then, so I kind of just want to transition to what's the possible, how likely is this to get funded? Well, I took this from the NIA website, and what you can see here is the pay line. So I'm still considered a new investigator. And, I do, and I want you to focus here. So this is the pay line at the NIA for Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease related disorders. So they're funding at the 31st percentile. So that's quite good. It's quite high, much higher than it's been in the past. And that's because Congress is allocating more resources. But, Dr. Shaw and I have talked he keeps encouraging me to submit this grant because the funding lines are so high and because, who knows how long that's going to last with the pandemic and the, potential recession coming on board. And what I could not find is, just general budgeting indicates that this study is likely to blow by the $500,000 per year for an NIH R01. I could not find any information about new investigators, the pay line for new investigators for AD and AD related disorders when the pay line is above the 500K level. So, just to kind of go through the process. So the four areas that NIH grants get reviewed upon. So significance. I believe this is a significant project. I believe it addresses a critical gap in the existing literature by better characterizing biopsychosocial factors that are associated with cognitive decline in rural living older adults. It meets the following NIH notice of special interest areas. So health disparities in Alzheimer's disease. They mention specifically rural populations, and then collaborative studies on Alzheimer's disease and ADRD. And so, this involves the harmonizing of data collection procedures between Rush and between the SIU rural cohort. And then in terms of innovation, environment, and approach, older adults residing in rural areas are underrepresented in aging research. And one of the missions since SIU School of Medicine was started is to address the healthcare needs of individuals who reside in central and southern Illinois. And so, that's a focus of our institution. And then I think using harmonized methods or harmonizing our methods, which with the Rush of the RADC, will allow us to compare the SIU rural cohort with the 5 existing cohort studies at Rush. And then, I believe that in the past, hopefully I've shown you that SIU LCAS has been relatively successful at recruiting older adults from rural areas, but at least in central Illinois. So I believe that supports the feasibility of the project. Now, investigator, that's me and the research team. So, this is probably, I acknowledge this is the biggest weakness area. I have not published a lot since I left Rush in 2013, and I've been mostly doing clinical work. I'm trying to, transition back to, hopefully with this project, and I'm trying to improve myself in that area. So I hope that we'll have 3 publications accepted before the grant's reviewed. We have the PCA paper, which is under review currently. We have the ADAS paper, which we're hoping to submit soon. And then I'd like this presentation to actually turn into a paper, the SIU Longitudinal Cognitive Aging Study, the past, present, and future. And now, a big question with NIH grants is always, does the study team have the expertise and knowledge for a project to be successful? So hopefully, I believe that we've demonstrated that this project can be successful based on the relative success I believe that we've had in following these LCAS study participants since the study was reopened in 2018. Logistically, we're limited by what we can do because the study is just, we're not funded, and I there's a manpower issue. I can only do so much as one person. So, and then, obviously I want to acknowledge that there's alternative outcomes. And then Dr. Shah and I have talked about remaining issues that we're hoping we can, resolve before the grant's submitted is, if the main study hypothesis that MCI and dementia prevalence rates are higher in rural areas, if that's not supported, that's actually a really important finding. I mean, it's important. So a null effect is actually also important. So I think that also, shows that the study does have some significance to it. And then, as I mentioned, preliminary budgeting that I've done based on the size of the research team and the resources that are necessary to do a study of this scale, it's going to surpass the 500K yearly direct cost threshold. So I wish I knew a little bit more about the funding rate for new investigators that are requesting more than 500K a year directly. I'm hoping I can get some of that information by contacting one of the program officers when I've got my specific aims page written, which I hope to share with anybody who wants it. I'm planning on getting that together within the next couple of weeks after this presentation. Certainly, we could improve the brain donation program if we're going to utilize the Rush protocols that are used for MAP. For example, we may have the participants complete the anatomical gift act form for their brain donation. Again, I've discussed with some of my collaborators in Carbondale. We're not sure if that population will be. We may have recruitment issues if we make brain donation a requirement for study enrollment. So that's something I guess is more of an empirical question. We can always evolve based on that. And then there's some ambiguity regarding costs for certain things. For travel to and from a participant's place of residence, from a funeral home to the site of brain collection. Those are costs that I'm still trying to get a good hold of. And even just doing the brain autopsy, who's actually going to perform the brain autopsy? We have a pathologist here in Springfield who can do it, and Dr. Sarko said she could do the autopsies there in Carbondale, but what's the best way to figure that out? And so that's pretty much all I wanted to present. I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have, and thank you for your attention. And again, this video this is a pre-recorded version of this video. I will be presenting it live, but for those of you that are not able to attend, we'll be posting this to the SIU School of Medicine YouTube channel, and we'll send out a link to anybody who's interested. Thank you very much for your time, and I'd love to discuss this with anybody in the future. I believe in this study. Thank you.